I loved a woman who wore a nurse's uniform and promised me forever. I gave her my savings, my last name, and my trust. But I didn't realize I was the other man, not until he knocked on my front door. I thought I was her husband. I wasn't even close. "You're going to be my husband someday, Clifford." Nerissa said it like she was ordering coffee, casual and certain, while cutting into her grilled fish at this beachside restaurant in Batangas. The waiter smiled and nodded like he'd heard it 1,000 times before. I felt my chest swell with something I hadn't felt in years. Pride, maybe, or just the simple joy of being chosen. "Is that right?" I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. My hands were shaking a little. At 54, after 2 marriages that ended with lawyers and bitter silences, I never thought I'd hear those words again, especially not from someone like her. Nerissa wore her nurse scrubs even on our weekend trips. Said it was easier than packing extra clothes. The pale blue fabric made her skin glow in the sunset light coming through the restaurant windows. She had this way of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, and she was doing it now, looking at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through all my defenses. "I'm serious, Cliff." She reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were small and warm. "I've been thinking about it a lot. You make me feel safe." Safe. That word hit me harder than I expected. Back in Ontario, my ex-wives had called me boring, predictable, emotionally unavailable. But Nerissa saw safety in the same qualities they'd grown to hate. Maybe that's what happens when you spend your days taking care of people who are broken, I thought. You start to value the men who don't break things. "You barely know me," I said, but I was already imagining it. Quiet mornings, coffee for 2, someone to come home to who actually wanted me there. "I know enough." She squeezed my hand. "I know you're kind. I know you don't yell when you're frustrated. I know you tip the cleaning lady even when she doesn't clean under the bed." She laughed, that soft laugh that made my stomach flip. "And I know you're lonely, just like me." The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. Most women I dated played games, said one thing and meant another. Nerissa just laid it out plain, like she was reading vital signs on a patient chart. "What makes you think I'm lonely?" I asked. "Because you came to the Philippines to retire, but you spend most of your time sitting in coffee shops watching other people live their lives." She wasn't being cruel, just observant. "And because when I asked you about your family last week, you got quiet for 10 minutes. She was right. I had 2 grown kids back home who called me twice a year, on my birthday and Christmas. They had their own lives, their own problems. My retirement savings were decent, my health was good, but I was drifting. Had been for months. "So what are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying maybe we can be lonely together for a while. See how it feels." She released my hand and went back to her fish. "Unless you're one of those expats who just wants to party and never commit to anything real. I'm not that guy." "Good," she smiled. "Because I don't have time for that guy." I paid the check, and we walked along the beach afterward. Nerissa kicked off her white nursing shoes and let her feet sink into the sand. The moon was full and the water was calm, lapping against the shore like a lullaby. I wanted to reach for her hand but didn't want to seem too eager. "Clifford?" She stopped walking and turned to face me. "Yeah?" I wasn't joking about the husband thing. My heart started pounding. "I didn't think you were." "Good. Because I've been hurt before, and I don't want to waste time if you're not serious." "I'm serious," I said, and I meant it. Standing there with the ocean behind her and the moonlight in her hair, I felt more awake than I had in years. This woman, this beautiful, smart, caring woman, was talking about a future with me, not despite my age or my history, but because of who I was right now, in this moment. "Then let's see where this goes," she said, and finally took my hand. We walked back to the resort in comfortable silence, her small fingers interlaced with mine. I was already planning our next weekend, already imagining what it would be like to wake up next to her every morning, already believing that maybe, at 54, I could still get love right. I met Nerissa 3 months earlier through a caregiving app. Of all things, I'd had minor surgery on my shoulder, nothing serious, but my doctor in Dumaguete recommended I hire someone to help with daily tasks for a few weeks. Cooking, cleaning, making sure I didn't lift anything heavy while the muscles healed. "I can cook basic Filipino food and some Western dishes," her profile said. "Registered nurse with 5 years experience. Patient. reliable, speaks fluent English. The photo showed her in scrubs outside a hospital, professional but warm. I liked that she didn't pose like she was trying to be a model. When she arrived at my rented condo that first morning, I was struck by how young she looked. 30-something, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes that suggested she'd been working the night shift. She carried a small bag with medical supplies and wore the same pale blue scrubs from her photo. "Mr. Clifford?" She pronounced my name carefully, like she'd been practicing. "I'm Nerissa. From the app. Just Cliff is fine." I opened the door wider. "Come in. Coffee? Please." She set her bag on the kitchen counter and looked around the space. It was a basic one-bedroom unit, furnished with the kind of heavy wooden furniture that landlords thought looked tropical. "How is your shoulder feeling this morning?" "Stiff, sore, nothing dramatic." She nodded and unpacked her supplies methodically. Blood pressure cuff, thermometer, small notebook. "I'll check your vitals first, then we can discuss what you need help with today." I'd hired caregivers before, back in Canada, when my dad was dying. Most of them were either overly cheerful or completely detached, treating the job like an assembly line. Nerissa felt different. She asked follow-up questions about my pain levels, made notes about my medication schedule, actually listened when I told her about my recovery goals. "You retired recently?" she asked while taking my blood pressure. 6 months ago. Plumbing contractor, for 30 years. I flexed my good arm. Figured it was time to stop crawling under houses and see what the rest of the world looked like. "And you chose the Philippines. Cheaper than Thailand, friendlier than Vietnam, and I liked the food." I paused. "Plus, I needed somewhere I could disappear for a while." She didn't ask why I needed to disappear, which I appreciated. Instead, she finished with the blood pressure cuff and made another note in her book. "Your numbers look good. Ready for breakfast?" That first week, Nerissa came every morning at 8 and stayed until lunch. She cooked simple meals, helped me shower without getting the surgical site wet, and organized my medications in a weekly pill dispenser. But what I remember most was how easy it was to talk to her. "Do you like being a nurse?" I asked one morning while she was scrambling eggs. "Most days." She added cheese to the pan. "Filipino hospitals are understaffed, so we work long shifts for not much money. But I like helping people feel better." "Is that why you do the caregiving on the side?" "Partly." She turned to look at me. "Also because I'm saving money." "For what?" "Maybe nursing school in Canada or America someday. The pay is better there, and the working conditions are more humane." She slid the eggs onto a plate. "But it's expensive to immigrate, and I don't have family abroad to sponsor me." I felt a pang of sympathy. Here was this smart, capable woman stuck in a system that undervalued her skills. "That's a good dream," I said. "Dreams don't pay rent." She sat down across from me with her own plate. "But they keep you going." By the second week, our conversations had moved beyond medical care. She told me about her childhood in Cebu, about nursing school, about the difficulty of finding decent housing in the city on a nurse's salary. I told her about my kids, about my failed marriages, about the strange loneliness of retirement. We laughed at the same TV shows. She made fun of my terrible Tagalog pronunciation. I taught her how to fix a leaky faucet. "You know, Cliff," she said one afternoon, while helping me put on a button-down shirt, "you're different from most of the foreign men I meet here." "How so?" "You don't treat me like I'm part of the furniture, and you don't act like you're doing me a favor by talking to me." She smoothed down my collar. "You're just normal." Normal. After 2 divorces and a lifetime of being told I was too quiet, too boring, too set in my ways, normal felt like the highest compliment anyone had ever given me. "Maybe that's because you make me feel normal too," I said. She looked up at me then, her hands still on my shirt, and something shifted between us. The air got heavier. The space between us felt charged. "Nerissa," I started to say. "I should go." She stepped back quickly. "Your shoulder is healing well. You probably don't need full-time help much longer." But she kept coming back. Even after my shoulder was fine, even after I could cook and clean for myself, she would stop by in the evenings after her hospital shifts. Sometimes with takeout dinner, sometimes just to talk. I started looking forward to those visits more than anything else in my day. "I don't want to impose," I told her one night. You're not imposing." She was sitting on my couch, shoes off, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. "I like talking to you. You listen to me. Is that rare?" "Very." She curled her legs under her. "Most men here, they think because I'm a nurse, I want to take care of them forever. They don't ask about my dreams or my opinions. They just want someone to cook and clean and not complain." I understood then why she kept coming back. Not because she needed the money, but because I saw her as a whole person. Because I asked about her dreams and actually cared about the answers. "Well," I said, "I like talking to you too." She smiled. "Good, because I was hoping you'd say that." 3 weeks after my shoulder healed, Nerissa started staying overnight. Not every night, but often enough that she kept a toothbrush in my bathroom and a change of clothes in my closet. She said it was practical, since she sometimes worked late shifts and my place was closer to the hospital than her shared apartment across town. Besides, she told me one evening while unpacking groceries in my kitchen, "You get dizzy sometimes when you stand up too fast. Someone should make sure you don't fall and hit your head." It was true. My blood pressure medication made me lightheaded occasionally, and I'd mentioned it to her once in passing. The fact that she remembered, that she cared enough to worry about it, made something warm spread through my chest. "You don't have to take care of me, you know," I said. "I'm not paying you anymore." "I know." She started washing vegetables in the sink. "Maybe I want to." Those words hit me like a physical force. When was the last time someone had wanted to take care of me? My ex-wives had treated caregiving like a burden, a duty they resented. My kids had their own families to worry about. But here was Nerissa, choosing to spend her free time making sure I was okay. "Why?" I asked. She turned to look at me, water dripping from her hands. "Because you're kind to me. Because you don't take me for granted. Because when I'm here, I feel peaceful." Peaceful. I knew exactly what she meant. The condo had become a sanctuary for both of us, a place where we could be ourselves without performance or pretense. "You make me feel peaceful too," I said. She smiled and returned to the vegetables. "Good. Then we're even." Nerissa cooked like she did everything else, with careful attention and genuine care. She learned my preferences quickly. How I liked my coffee strong but not bitter. How I preferred fish to pork. How I always saved room for dessert but felt guilty about it. "Eat the ice cream, Cliff," she would say, pushing the container across the table toward me. "Life's too short to feel guilty about small pleasures." She was right, of course. I'd spent so many years denying myself anything that might be seen as indulgent or frivolous. But with Nerissa, I felt permission to enjoy things again. To laugh at stupid movies. To sleep in on weekends. To eat ice cream without calculating calories. "You know what I love about you?" she said one night while we were watching a cheesy action movie on her laptop. "What?" "You don't try to be someone you're not. You're just Cliff. Quiet, steady, reliable Cliff, who tips grocery store clerks and says thank you to bus drivers." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "That just seems like basic decency." "Exactly." She leaned against my shoulder. "You think basic decency is basic. Most people think it's optional." We started holding hands during movies. Then she began falling asleep on my couch, curled up against my side like a cat seeking warmth. I would carry her to my bed and sleep on the couch myself, wanting her to be comfortable but not wanting to assume anything. "Cliff," she said one morning, standing in my bedroom doorway in one of my t-shirts, "you don't have to sleep on the couch. I don't want you to feel pressured. The only pressure I feel is the pressure of you being too much of a gentleman." She sat on the edge of the bed. "I trust you. I wouldn't be here if I didn't." That night, we lay in bed talking until dawn. Not about anything profound, just the small details of our lives. Her favorite flowers, my worst childhood injury, the foods we missed from our respective homes. Her skin was warm against mine, and I felt more connected to another human being than I had in years. "Nerissa," I whispered into the darkness. "I'm falling in love with you." She was quiet for so long I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she rolled over to face me, her eyes serious in the dim light from the window. "I know," she said. "I'm falling in love with you too." The next morning she made pancakes from scratch and sang softly in Tagalog while she cooked. I watched her move around my kitchen like she belonged there, like she'd been there for years instead of weeks. She wore one of my old work shirts over her underwear, and her hair was messy from sleep, and I thought she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "What are you smiling about?" she asked, catching me staring. "Just this, you, us." She set a plate in front of me and kissed the top of my head. "Get used to it, old man. I'm not going anywhere." I started giving her money, not for caregiving services, but just to help. Small amounts at first, 1,000 pesos here and there for groceries or gas for her motorcycle. She always protested, "You don't need to do that, Cliff. I want to help. You work so hard, and nurses don't get paid enough here." "But we're not. I mean, you don't owe me anything." "It's not about owing, it's about caring." I pressed the bills into her hand. "Let me take care of you for once." Eventually, she stopped protesting. She would accept the money with a grateful smile and use it for practical things. New scrubs for work, repairs on her motorcycle, medicine for her mother back in Cebu. I liked knowing that I could make her life a little easier, that my presence in her world was a net positive. "You're too good to me," she would say. "Impossible," I would reply. "There's no such thing as too good." But sometimes, late at night when she thought I was asleep, I would catch her texting someone. The soft glow of her phone screen would light up her face, and she would type quickly, like she was having an urgent conversation. When I asked about it, she said it was her family checking on her. "My brother worries when I stay out late," she explained. "Filipino families are very protective." It made sense. I didn't push the issue. Everyone deserved privacy, and I didn't want to be the jealous foreign boyfriend who monitored his girlfriend's communications. Trust was important. I trusted her. The first crack in my perfect picture appeared on a Tuesday morning in November. Nerissa was getting ready for her shift at the hospital, putting on her scrubs and gathering her things, when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and immediately declined the call. "Wrong number," she said, but I caught the flash of recognition in her eyes before she looked away. The phone rang again. This time she turned it off completely. "Persistent wrong number," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Telemarketers." She kissed my cheek. "They're terrible here. Once they get your number, they never stop calling." It was a reasonable explanation. I forgot about it until it happened again the next week, and the week after that. Always the same pattern. Phone rings, Nerissa checks the screen, immediate decline or quick shutdown. Always with a slight tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Maybe you should change your number," I suggested one evening after watching her decline 3 calls in a row during dinner. "It's not that simple. All my patients have this number. The hospital has this number." She stabbed at her rice with unnecessary force. "I'll deal with it." I dropped the subject, but I started noticing other small inconsistencies, like how she never wanted to video call when she was at home in her own apartment. Always voice calls only, and always with background noise that didn't quite sound like a busy shared flat. "Is your roommate having a party?" I asked during one particularly loud call. "What?" "Oh yes. She has friends over. Very inconsiderate." But her voice sounded distant, distracted, like she was listening to something else while talking to me. Or the way she suddenly became protective of her phone, keeping it face down during meals and taking it with her to the bathroom. Before, she used to leave it lying around carelessly, sometimes asking me to check her messages if she was cooking or had wet hands. "Everything okay?" I asked one night, when she jumped slightly as her phone buzzed on the nightstand. "Just tired. Long shift today." She reached for the phone quickly. "I'm going to turn this off so it doesn't wake us up." But I wasn't asleep an hour later when I felt her slip out of bed. Through the crack in the bathroom door, I could see the soft glow of her phone screen and hear her whispering urgently in rapid Tagalog. When she came back to bed, she was tense, her breathing shallow. "Bad news from home?" I asked softly. "My mother is having health problems," she said into the darkness. My brother was updating me. I reached for her hand. "Is there anything I can do? Do you need to send money?" No. She'll be fine. Just family drama." Family drama. It seemed like she was having a lot of family drama lately. Always at odd hours, always requiring whispered phone conversations and secretive text exchanges. The biggest red flag came 3 weeks later. We were walking through a shopping mall in Dumaguete when a man approached us. He was Filipino, maybe 40, wearing a nice shirt and carrying shopping bags. When he saw Nerissa, his face lit up with recognition. "Nerissa," he said something to her in rapid Tagalog, gesturing enthusiastically. Nerissa's entire body went rigid. She responded in the same language, her tone sharp and dismissive. The man looked confused, then hurt, then angry. He said something else, looked at me, then back at her with what seemed like accusation in his voice. "I have to go," Nerissa said to me suddenly, grabbing my arm. "We need to leave. Now." "What was that about?" I asked as she practically dragged me toward the exit. "Nothing. Just someone from work, being inappropriate." But it hadn't looked like a work interaction. The man had seemed familiar with her, comfortable, like someone who knew her well. And the look he'd given me wasn't the look of a colleague who'd overstepped boundaries. It was the look of someone who'd been betrayed. "Nerissa," I said when we got to the parking garage. "Who was that really?" "I told you, someone from work." She was digging through her purse frantically, looking for her motorcycle keys. "Can we please not make this into something it's not?" "I'm not making it into anything. I'm just asking a question." And I answered it. Her voice was sharp now, defensive in a way I'd never heard before. "Can we go home now?" We rode back to my condo in tense silence, her body stiff behind me on the motorcycle. That night, she said she needed to sleep at her own place, something about an early shift and not wanting to wake me. For the first time since we'd started staying over together, I went to bed alone. I lay awake for hours, replaying the interaction at the mall. The man's face when he saw us together, Nerissa's panic, her refusal to explain, the defensive anger when I pressed for details. I wanted to trust her. I needed to trust her. Because if I couldn't trust Nerissa, if this relationship was built on lies or deception, then I was exactly the pathetic old fool my ex-wives had always said I was. A man so desperate for love that he'd ignore obvious warning signs just to avoid being alone. But trust was becoming harder when every instinct I had was telling me that something wasn't right, that the woman I loved was keeping significant secrets from me, that maybe, despite all her words about honesty and openness, I didn't know Nerissa as well as I thought I did. She's allowed to have a life, I told myself the next morning over coffee. She's allowed to have privacy. Not everything has to involve me. But privacy and secrecy weren't the same thing. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I'd been accepting a lot of things that didn't quite add up just because I didn't want to be the suspicious foreign boyfriend who questioned everything. Maybe it was time to start asking better questions. "Cliff, I've been thinking about something important." Nerissa set down her coffee cup and looked at me with that serious expression she got when discussing her nursing shifts or family problems. We were having breakfast at our usual weekend spot, a small cafe near the beach that served decent Western food and didn't mind if we lingered over multiple cups of coffee. "What's on your mind?" "Us. Our future." She reached across the table and took my hand. "I meant what I said about wanting to marry you, but I think we need to be practical about how we make it happen." My heart started beating faster. We'd talked about marriage in general terms, the someday maybe conversations that couples have when they're testing the waters of commitment. But this felt different, more concrete. Practical how? Well, if we want to build a life together, we need to think about where that life will be. She traced circles on the back of my hand with her thumb. "I love the Philippines, but my nursing credentials would be worth more in Canada, and you'd be closer to your children." I hadn't considered moving back to Canada. After the divorce settlements and legal fees, I had enough money to live comfortably here, but not enough to maintain the same lifestyle back home. Plus, I'd grown to love the slower pace of life in the Philippines, the warmth of the people, the simplicity of daily routines that didn't revolve around accumulating more stuff. "Are you saying you want to move to Canada?" "I'm saying maybe we should explore the possibility. But to do that legally, as a couple, we'd need to be married." She paused, studying my face. "And for the visa application to work smoothly, it would help if we were married here first, before applying for spousal immigration." The logistics made sense, but something about the way she presented it felt calculated, like she'd researched this thoroughly before bringing it up. "Have you looked into this already?" "A little. I have a friend who married an Australian man and moved to Melbourne. She said the process goes much faster if you can prove the marriage is legitimate, with photos and documents showing a real relationship over time." I squeezed her hand. "And you want that? To leave everything you know here and start over in a place where you've never been?" "For the right person, yes." She leaned forward. "Cliff, I love you. I love the man you are, the way you treat me, the life we could build together. But I also love myself enough to want a future where I can use my education and earn what I'm worth. It was a fair point. Filipino nurses were incredibly skilled but drastically underpaid. In Canada, she could make 3 times her current salary and work in hospitals with better equipment and more reasonable patient loads. So what are you proposing? I'm proposing that we get engaged. Officially. Then we start the paperwork for a spousal visa while planning our wedding. She smiled. It might take a year or 2 for all the approvals to come through, which gives us time to save money and prepare. That evening, I called my sister Sarah in Toronto. I'd been meaning to tell my family about Nerissa for months but hadn't found the right moment. Long-distance relationships were hard enough to explain. Long-distance relationships with significant age gaps in foreign countries sounded like the beginning of a cautionary tale. You want to marry a Filipino nurse you met 3 months ago? Sarah's voice carried that particular blend of concern and judgment that only older sisters can master. It's been 6 months, and yes, I know how it sounds. Cliff, please tell me you're being careful. There are so many scams targeting Western men in Southeast Asia. She's not scamming me, Sarah. She's a registered nurse with a legitimate job and her own apartment. She doesn't ask me for money, but she wants to move to Canada. Lots of healthcare workers want to move to Canada. It's not exactly a red flag, Sarah sighed. I'm not trying to be negative, but this is exactly the kind of situation where men get taken advantage of. Older guy, recently divorced, lonely, living abroad. I'm not an idiot. I know you're not. But you're also not 25 anymore, and love makes people do stupid things at any age. I understood her concern, but I also resented the implication that I was too naive or desperate to recognize genuine feelings. Yes, there were predatory relationships that followed the pattern she described, but there were also real love stories, real marriages, real partnerships between people from different countries and backgrounds. I love her, Sarah. And she loves me. We're happy together. Then why rush into marriage and immigration paperwork? If it's real, it'll still be real in a few years. Because Nerissa was 32 and didn't want to waste years of her life in a relationship that wasn't going anywhere. Because I was 54 and knew that good things could disappear if you waited too long to claim them. Because sometimes you had to take a leap of faith if you wanted anything better than what you already had. But I didn't say any of that to Sarah. Instead, I promised to be careful and ended the call feeling more determined than ever to prove that my relationship with Nerissa was the real thing. 2 weeks later, I bought an engagement ring. Nothing extravagant, but a decent gold band with a small diamond from a jewelry store in the city. The saleswoman wrapped it in a velvet box and congratulated me in heavily accented English. I proposed on the beach where we'd had our first conversation about marriage. Nerissa said yes before I'd finished my rehearsed speech, laughing and crying at the same time as I slipped the ring onto her finger. It's perfect, she said, admiring the way the diamond caught the sunset light. You're perfect. We called each other fiancé and fiancée after that. She started referring to me as her future husband when introducing me to shop clerks and restaurant servers. I opened a joint bank account and added her as an authorized user on my credit card. We met with a visa consultant who confirmed that spousal immigration was possible, but would require extensive documentation and probably 18 months of processing time. The key is proving that your relationship is genuine, the consultant explained, sliding forms across his desk. Immigration officers look for evidence of shared financial responsibility, cohabitation, social integration, and long-term commitment. We started building that evidence systematically. Photos of us together at family gatherings and social events. Joint utility bills from my condo. Bank statements showing regular financial interactions. Letters from friends and colleagues who could attest to our relationship. But even as we checked all the bureaucratic boxes, I noticed that Nerissa seemed more focused on the paperwork than the romance. She researched Canadian immigration law with the same intensity she brought to medical procedures. She saved every receipt and document with meticulous care. She asked detailed questions about my financial situation and future earning potential. I just want to make sure we're prepared, she said when I commented on her thoroughness. Immigration is serious business. We can't afford to make mistakes. She was right, of course, but sometimes I felt like I was helping her build a case for immigration rather than planning a wedding, like the marriage was just a necessary step in a larger strategic plan. I pushed those doubts aside. Nerissa was practical about everything, from her nursing career to her family finances. It made sense that she'd approach our future with the same methodical planning. That didn't make her feelings any less real. But late at night, when she thought I was asleep, I still heard her whispering urgently into her phone. Still saw her typing quick text messages and deleting them immediately. Still noticed how she deflected questions about her family or her life before we met. Trust takes time, I told myself. She'll open up when she's ready. I just hoped I was right. The knock came on a Tuesday afternoon while Nerissa was at work. I was reading on the balcony, enjoying the afternoon breeze and a cup of coffee, when I heard 3 measured raps on my front door. Not the urgent pounding of an emergency, not the tentative tap of a nervous visitor, just 3 confident knocks from someone who expected to be answered. I opened the door to find a Filipino man, maybe 35, wearing clean jeans and a polo shirt. He was shorter than me but stocky, with calloused hands and the kind of deep tan that came from working outdoors. He held a manila envelope against his chest and looked at me with calm, tired eyes. "Mr. Clifford?" His English was clear but careful, each word deliberately pronounced. "Yes, my name is Joel Reyes. I think we need to talk." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. This wasn't a neighbor with a noise complaint or a utility worker needing access to my meter. This felt serious in a way I couldn't identify yet. About what? About Nerissa. He held up the envelope. "May I come in?" I should have said no. Should have asked for identification, demanded to know how he knew my name and where I lived. But there was something in his expression, a kind of resigned determination, that made me step aside and let him enter. Joel looked around my living room, taking in the photos of Nerissa and me on the coffee table, her nursing textbooks on the bookshelf, her slippers by the door. His face remained neutral, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Nice place," he said. "She always liked nice things." The casual familiarity in his voice made my blood run cold. "How do you know Nerissa?" Joel sat down on my couch without being invited and opened the manila envelope. "She's my wife." The words hit me like a physical blow. "That's impossible." "I wish it was." He pulled out a stack of photographs and laid them on my coffee table, wedding photos. Nerissa in a white dress, smiling radially, her arms around this man I'd never seen before. The same Nerissa who wore my engagement ring, who called me her future husband, who'd spent the last 6 months planning our life together. I sat down heavily in my chair, staring at the photos. In one, Nerissa was feeding Joel wedding cake, both of them laughing. In another, they were dancing, her head resting on his shoulder. The dress was beautiful, traditional Filipino design with intricate beadwork. The setting looked like a church wedding, formal and public. "When?" I managed to ask. 3 years ago, December 15th, 2021. Joel pulled out a marriage certificate, official looking with government seals and signatures. Blessed Sacrament Church in Cebu City. I studied the document, looking for some sign that it was fake, some detail that would prove this was an elaborate scam or case of mistaken identity. But the signatures looked real. The dates matched what Joel had said, and the photograph attached to the certificate was unmistakably Nerissa. "She told me she'd never been married," I said. "She tells a lot of people that." Joel pulled out more documents. A birth certificate for a child named Miguel Reyes, born June 2022. Mother, Nerissa Santos Reyes. Father, Joel Reyes. The room started spinning. A child. Nerissa had a child, a baby who would be barely 2 years old now. All those late-night phone calls, all those secretive text messages, all those times she said she was dealing with family drama. Where's the child now? My voice sounded like it was coming from someone else. With my mother in Cebu. Nerissa sends money when she can, but she hasn't seen him in 4 months. Joel's voice carried a mixture of sadness and anger. "She's been too busy playing house with you." I looked at the birth certificate again, focusing on the date. June 2022. That was only 5 months before I met Nerissa. She'd been recovering from childbirth, adjusting to life as a new mother, while I thought I was meeting a single woman who'd never been seriously involved with anyone. "How did you find me?" I followed her. Last week, when she said she was working a double shift, I saw her come here instead. Joel gathered the photos back into a neat stack. "I've known about you for months, Mr. Clifford. The money you've been giving her, the engagement ring, the visa applications." "She told you about the visa applications?" She didn't have to. I saw the paperwork in her apartment. Immigration forms with your name on them. He leaned forward. Did you really think she loved you? The question hit me like a slap. Of course I thought she loved me. She'd said it countless times. She'd planned our future together. She'd accepted my proposal. But sitting here, looking at photos of her real wedding, her real life, her real family, I felt like the biggest fool who'd ever lived. She seems to love me, I said weakly. I'm sure she does. You're her ticket out of here. Joel's voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel but not gentle either. A Canadian citizenship, a nursing job that pays real money, a life where she doesn't have to choose between buying diapers and paying rent. And you? What do you want? I want my wife back. I want my son to know his mother. I want to stop pretending that she's working late shifts when I know she's here with you. Joel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the view that Nerissa and I had enjoyed together so many mornings. I'm not angry with you, Mr. Clifford. You didn't know, but I need you to understand that you're not her first choice. You're her best option. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't quite process why yet. First choice versus best option. Love versus strategy. What do you want me to do? Nothing. I'll talk to her myself. He returned to the couch and started putting the documents back in the envelope. But I thought you deserved to know the truth before you invested any more money or emotion in this relationship. Why are you telling me this now? Why not months ago? Joel was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands, because I hoped she'd come back on her own. Because I thought maybe if I gave her space, she'd realize that running away wasn't solving anything. He looked up at me. But the visa paperwork changed everything. That's not temporary. That's permanent. I understood. As long as Nerissa was just having an affair, there was still hope for their marriage. But immigration to another country meant she was planning to disappear from their lives entirely. Does she know you're here? No. And I'd prefer to keep it that way until I talk to her. Joel stood up. But she'll figure it out soon enough. After he left, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the engagement photos of Nerissa and me that were still scattered on my coffee table. In one, we were laughing at something I'd said. In another, she was showing off her ring to the camera. She looked genuinely happy in all of them, genuinely in love. But how could I trust my own perception anymore? If she could lie about being married, if she could hide a child, if she could maintain a double life for 6 months without me suspecting anything, then maybe every emotion I thought I'd seen was just another performance. I picked up one of the photos of us together and studied her face, looking for signs of deception I'd missed, but all I saw was the woman I'd fallen in love with. The woman who made me pancakes and sang in Tagalog while cooking. The woman who worried about my blood pressure and stayed up late talking about our dreams. Maybe that's what made it so devastating. It wasn't that she'd been completely fake. It was that some part of it had been real, but not real enough to matter more than her other priorities. I was still sitting there when my phone rang. Nerissa's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I needed to hear her voice, needed to see if I could detect the lie in it now that I knew what to listen for. "Hi, love," she said, her voice bright and familiar. "I'm just finishing up my shift. Want me to bring dinner home?" Home. She called my place home, even though her real home was with Joel and their son. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. "Whatever you want. You sound tired. Everything okay?" Everything was not okay. Everything was the opposite of okay. But I couldn't confront her over the phone, couldn't have this conversation while she was at work, surrounded by colleagues who knew nothing about her double life. "Just a long day. I'll see you tonight." "I love you, Cliff." "I love you too," I said automatically, then immediately hated myself for it. Did I still love her? Could you love someone who'd been lying to you about everything that mattered? Or was what I felt now just the ghost of love, the emotional muscle memory of happiness that hadn't caught up to reality yet? I had 3 hours before she came home. 3 hours to decide how to handle this conversation. 3 hours to figure out if I wanted to fight for a relationship that might have been a lie from the beginning, or if I wanted to walk away from the best thing that had happened to me in years. 3 hours to accept that I'd been living someone else's fantasy, and it was time to wake up. Nerissa came home at 7:30 with takeout from the Vietnamese place we both liked. She was humming when she walked through the door, still in her scrubs, carrying plastic bags that smelled like pho and spring rolls. She looked happy, relaxed, like someone coming home to the person she loved after a long day at work. "Sorry I'm late. We had an emergency surgery that ran over." She kissed my cheek and headed to the kitchen. "I got extra shrimp in your pho because I know you've been working out more." I watched her unpack the food with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. Arranging the containers on the counter, getting out bowls and chopsticks, making sure everything was perfect before we sat down to eat. It was such a familiar routine, something we'd done dozens of times before. But tonight it felt like watching a stranger perform a role. "Nerissa, She was ladling soup into bowls, focused on not spilling. "We need to talk." Something in my tone made her pause. She set down the ladle and turned to look at me, and I saw a flicker of wariness cross her face before she forced a smile. "That sounds serious. Did I forget to pay a bill or something? Joel came to see me today." The bowl slipped from her hands and shattered on the kitchen floor. Hot broth splashed across the tiles and soaked into her white nursing shoes. She stared down at the mess for a long moment, then slowly looked up at me. "I see." That was it. No denial, no explanation, no tears or apologies or desperate attempts to convince me that there was some innocent explanation. Just "I see," like I'd told her the weather forecast. "Is that all you have to say?" Nerissa grabbed a dish towel and knelt down to clean up the broken ceramic. "What do you want me to say, Cliff?" "I want you to explain how you forgot to mention that you're married and have a child." She wiped up the soup methodically, piling the broken pieces on the towel. "It's complicated. Complicated." I sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly feeling exhausted. "You're married to another man and you have a 2-year-old son, but it's complicated." "Yes." She stood up and threw the towel in the trash. "Joel and we're not really together anymore. We haven't been for over a year. But you're still married. Legally, yes, but not in any way that matters." I stared at her. Even now, caught in a lie that had destroyed everything between us, she was trying to minimize the truth, to make it sound less significant than it was. "You have a child together?" "Miguel, yes." For the first time, her composure cracked slightly. "He's a beautiful little boy, and you've been planning to move to Canada and just leave him?" "I was going to bring him with me. Once I got established, once I could prove I had a stable income and housing." She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed defensively. "Immigration is easier if you're married to a Canadian citizen. It would have opened doors for both of us." The cold calculation in her voice made my stomach turn. She'd mapped out the entire strategy. Use me to get to Canada, then bring her real family over once she was settled. I wasn't her husband. I was her immigration lawyer. "What about Joel?" "What about him?" Her voice hardened. "Joel is a construction worker who makes 8,000 pesos a month when he can find work. He drinks too much, and he has no ambition beyond the next job site. What kind of future could I build with him? You married him. I was pregnant, and my family pressured me. We barely knew each other." She pushed her hair back from her face, a gesture I'd always found endearing but now seemed calculated. "People make mistakes, Cliff. And I was what? A way to fix your mistake?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she looked up at me, her eyes were dry but tired. "You were kind to me. You treated me well. You offered me opportunities I could never have otherwise." She paused. "But yes, if I'm being honest, you were also a solution to my problems." At least she was finally being honest. It should have hurt more, but I felt strangely numb, like I was watching this conversation happen to someone else. "Did you ever love me?" "I cared about you. I enjoyed our time together. You made me feel safe and valued." She spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. "But love? The kind of love you're talking about? I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore." I understood then why she'd never seemed quite present during our most intimate moments, why she'd been so focused on the practical aspects of our relationship rather than the emotional ones, why she'd been able to lie to my face for 6 months without seeming to feel guilty about it. "So what now? Now I pack my things and go back to my real life." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was discussing a work schedule change. "Joel made his choice when he decided to come here. I assume he wants me to come home. And you'll do that? Just go back to him?" "Where else would I go? You're not going to want me here anymore, and I can't afford my own place without the money you've been giving me." She shrugged. "Joel might be disappointed in me, but he won't throw me out on the street." The resignation in her voice was almost worse than anger would have been. She wasn't devastated by the end of our relationship, she was just disappointed that her plan hadn't worked out. "I'm sorry, Cliff." She moved toward the bedroom to start packing. "I never meant for it to go this far. I thought maybe I could find a way to make everyone happy." "How would this have made everyone happy?" "You would have had a wife who took care of you. I would have had a better life for myself and my son. Joel would have been free to find someone who actually wanted to be with him." She paused in the doorway. It could have worked. I sat alone in the kitchen while she gathered her belongings. I could hear her moving around the bedroom, opening drawers and closing them, the soft sound of clothes being folded and packed. She was efficient even in leaving, taking only what belonged to her and leaving no mess behind. 20 minutes later, she emerged with a small suitcase and her nursing bag. She'd changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a t-shirt, and she looked younger somehow, more like the woman I'd first met than the fiancée she'd pretended to be. "I'll leave your ring on the counter," she said. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She stood by the door for a moment, like she was waiting for me to say something. To forgive her, maybe, or to beg her to stay. But I had nothing left to say. The woman I'd loved had never really existed, and the woman standing in front of me was a stranger who'd been using my loneliness against me. "Take care of yourself, Cliff. You're a good man. You deserve better than this." Then she was gone, and I was alone in my condo with the smell of spilled pho and the sound of my own breathing. On the kitchen counter, my grandmother's engagement ring sat next to a note with Joel's phone number and the words "in case you want to talk." I picked up the ring and held it up to the light. It looked smaller than I remembered, less significant. Just a piece of metal and stone that had briefly represented a future that was never real. Outside, I heard a motorcycle start up and drive away. Nerissa, going back to her real life, her real husband, her real responsibilities. I sat there until the food got cold, trying to figure out what I was supposed to feel. Angry? Heartbroken? Embarrassed? But mostly I just felt empty, like something had been carved out of my chest and I was still bleeding internally. The worst part wasn't that she'd lied to me. The worst part was that even knowing the truth, part of me still missed her. Still wanted to believe that some of it had been real. But wanting something to be true didn't make it true. And I was finally old enough to know the difference. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on my balcony watching the sun rise over Dumaguete Bay, drinking coffee and taking inventory of the life I'd built around a lie. The engagement photos were still scattered on my coffee table. The joint bank account still had both our names on it. Her shampoo was still in my shower, and her favorite coffee mug was still in my dish rack. 6 months of shared routines, eliminated in a single conversation. But the physical reminders weren't what haunted me. What kept me awake was the realization of how completely I'd restructured my entire existence around Nerissa. I'd stopped calling my kids regularly because I was always busy with her. I'd turned down invitations from other expats because I preferred quiet evenings at home. I'd even stopped reading the books I loved because she found them boring. When had I become so willing to disappear into someone else's life? I called my son Michael in Vancouver that morning. It was evening there, and he sounded surprised to hear from me. "Dad, is everything okay? You never call on weekdays." "I'm fine. Just wanted to hear your voice." I paused, not sure how to explain why I was calling. "How's Emma? How's school going?" "She's good. 2nd grade is kicking her butt, but she's loving it. Sarah's been helping her with reading." Michael's voice softened. "You should come visit soon. Emma asks about her grandpa in the Philippines all the time." Grandpa in the Philippines. That's how my granddaughter thought of me now. Not as the man who used to fix her bicycle or take her fishing, but as a distant figure living on the other side of the world. "Maybe I will," I said. "Maybe sooner than you think." "Really? That would be great. What's going on? You sound different." Different. That was the right word. I felt like I was seeing myself clearly for the first time in months, and I didn't like what I saw. A 54-year-old man who'd been so desperate for companionship that he'd ignored obvious warning signs, so grateful for attention that he'd accepted secrecy as normal, so afraid of being alone that he'd convinced himself isolation was the same as contentment. "Just reassessing some things," I told Michael. "I'll call you again soon." After we hung up, I walked through my condo and started removing traces of Nerissa. Not angrily, not dramatically, just methodically. I put her books in a box. I deleted her contact information from my phone. I closed the joint bank account and canceled her access to my credit card. Each action felt like taking a breath after being underwater for too long. The hardest part was looking at our photos together. In every single one, I looked happy in a way I hadn't been happy in years. Relaxed, confident, like a man who'd finally figured out how to be loved. But now I couldn't tell if that happiness had been real or just relief at not being alone anymore. Had I ever actually known Nerissa, or had I just fallen in love with the idea of being chosen by someone young and beautiful and kind? Had I been in love with her, or with the version of myself that existed when I was with her? I remembered Sarah's warning about older men getting taken advantage of abroad. I'd been so defensive, so certain that my situation was different, that my relationship was real. But maybe the difference between love and delusion was smaller than I'd wanted to admit. The visa consultant called that afternoon to schedule our next appointment. I told him the engagement was off and asked him to shred all our paperwork. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Morrison. These things happen more often than you might think." His voice was professionally sympathetic. International relationships can be complicated. Complicated. The same word Nerissa had used to describe her marriage to Joel. I was starting to hate that word. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "In your experience, how often are these relationships genuine? The foreign man, local woman, immigration applications?" He was quiet for a moment. "That's a difficult question to answer. Some are absolutely genuine. But," he paused, "let's just say that for many people in developing countries, marriage to a Western citizen represents opportunities that don't exist otherwise." "And the Western men? Do they usually know?" "Some do. Some prefer not to know. And some, like yourself, discover the truth eventually." He sighed. "My advice is always to take these relationships slowly, but loneliness makes people impatient." Loneliness makes people impatient. That was exactly what had happened to me. I'd been so starved for connection that I'd accelerated past all the normal stages of getting to know someone. I'd moved from caregiver to girlfriend to fiancé in 6 months, never taking time to really understand who Nerissa was when she wasn't performing for me. That evening, I went for a long walk through the city center. Dumaguete was beautiful in the early evening light, with families sharing dinner at outdoor restaurants and children playing in the plaza. I'd grown to love this place, but now I wondered if that love had been tied up with my feelings for Nerissa, if I could still be happy here without her, or if everything would remind me of the fool I'd been. I passed the mall where we'd encountered the man who'd recognized her, the restaurant where she'd first called me her future husband, the jewelry store where I'd bought her engagement ring. Each location felt like a crime scene now, a place where I'd been complicit in my own deception. But as I walked, I also started to feel something else besides sadness and embarrassment. Relief, maybe. Or just the absence of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. No more wondering about the mysterious phone calls. No more trying to decode her moods or figure out why she sometimes seemed distant. No more walking on eggshells around topics that made her uncomfortable. The truth, even when it hurt, was easier to live with than constant uncertainty. I stopped at a small bar near the waterfront and ordered a beer. The owner, an older Filipino man named Roberto, had served me many times before, usually when I was with Nerissa. "Where is your beautiful nurse tonight?" he asked, setting down the bottle. "She won't be coming around anymore," I said. "We broke up." Roberto nodded sympathetically. "These things happen. Love is complicated in the Philippines. So I'm learning. But you know what, my friend? Better to find out now than after many years of marriage." He leaned on the bar. "I see many foreign men here who stay in bad relationships because they're afraid of being alone. But being alone is not the worst thing. Being with the wrong person is much worse." I finished my beer and walked home as the sun set over the bay. My condo felt different when I entered it. Not empty, exactly, but mine again. I could watch whatever I wanted on television. I could eat dinner at whatever time I chose. I could go to bed early or stay up late without consulting anyone else's schedule. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe deeply. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. And when I woke up the next morning, I didn't immediately reach for my phone to check for messages from Nerissa. Instead, I made coffee for one and sat on my balcony, watching the city wake up below me. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. There was a difference, and I was finally old enough to appreciate it. 3 days after Nerissa left, I bought a ferry ticket to Mindoro. Not because I was running away, but because I needed to be somewhere that didn't hold memories of us together. Somewhere I could think clearly without seeing her ghost in every corner of my daily routine. The ferry ride took 4 hours through choppy seas that made most passengers seasick. I stood on the deck watching the Philippines slide by, small islands and fishing villages scattered across the water like stepping stones. The salt spray and diesel fumes should have been unpleasant, but they felt cleansing somehow, like I was washing off the last 6 months and starting fresh. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, didn't book a hotel in advance or research activities or plan an itinerary. For the first time since arriving in the Philippines, I was traveling with no purpose beyond getting away from my own thoughts. The ferry docked in Calapan just after sunset. I found a small guest house near the port, a basic place with concrete walls and a ceiling fan that sounded like a helicopter. The elderly woman who ran it spoke minimal English, but she understood 1 room, 3 nights, and showed me to a space barely larger than my bathroom back home. It was perfect. That first night, I walked to a local restaurant where I was the only foreigner. The menu was entirely in Tagalog, so I pointed at what other people were eating and hoped for the best. The food was simple and delicious. Grilled fish, rice, vegetables cooked with garlic and ginger. No one tried to practice their English on me or asked where I was from. I was just another customer, anonymous and unremarkable. I ate slowly, listening to conversations I couldn't understand, watching families share meals and laugh at jokes I couldn't follow. It felt good to be irrelevant, to exist without having to explain myself or perform any particular version of who I was supposed to be. After dinner, I walked along the waterfront. Calapan wasn't a tourist destination, just a working port city with fishing boats and cargo vessels tied up at weathered docks. The air smelled like seaweed and engine oil. Street vendors sold grilled meat and cold drinks to dock workers finishing their shifts. I bought a bottle of beer from a convenience store and sat on a bench facing the water. Ships' lights moved slowly across the horizon, heading to destinations I couldn't identify. For the first time since Joel had knocked on my door, I felt something approaching peace. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart jumped, thinking it might be Nerissa. But it was just a notification from my bank about automatic bill payment. I turned off the phone and slipped it into my pocket. The next morning, I rented a motorcycle and rode inland toward the mountains. The roads were narrow and poorly maintained, winding through rice paddies and small villages where children waved from their front yards. I stopped frequently, not because I was tired but because I wanted to absorb everything slowly. At a roadside stand, I bought fresh mangoes from a farmer who spoke excellent English and wanted to practice his conversation skills. He told me about his children, his hopes for better rice prices, his concerns about climate change affecting the growing season. We talked for an hour, sitting in the shade of his fruit trees, and it was the most honest conversation I'd had with anyone in months. "You seem sad, sir," he said as I was preparing to leave. "Vacation should make you happy." "I'm not sad," I said, surprised to realize it was true. "Just thinking." "Ah, thinking is good. But too much thinking can make a man forget how to live." That afternoon, I found a small beach where I was the only visitor. The sand was dark, volcanic rock, and the water was warm and clear. I swam until my arms ached, then lay on the beach, letting the sun dry my skin. When was the last time I'd done something just because it felt good? When had I stopped paying attention to simple physical pleasures like warm water and sunshine? I thought about Nerissa, but without the sharp pain I'd been expecting. The betrayal still hurt, but it was starting to feel like something that had happened to me rather than something that was happening to me. Past tense instead of present tense. I understood now why she'd chosen me. I was safe, financially stable, emotionally available, and desperately lonely. I represented everything her life with Joel wasn't. Security, opportunity, a chance to start over in a place where her mistakes wouldn't follow her. I didn't blame her for wanting those things. If I'd been a 32-year-old single mother trapped in a marriage to a man I didn't love, struggling to make ends meet in a country with limited opportunities, I might have made similar choices. But understanding her motivations didn't make the deception acceptable. She could have been honest about her situation from the beginning, could have explained that she was looking for a way out of her marriage, that she needed help building a better life for herself and her son. I might have said yes to that arrangement if it had been presented as what it was rather than disguised as romance. The lie was what hurt. Not the transaction, but the pretense that it was something else. On my third evening in Mindoro, I sat on the beach watching the sunset and finally deleted Nerissa's number from my phone. I deleted our photos, our text message history, every digital trace of our relationship. It felt ceremonial, like I was finally laying something to rest. I thought about calling Joel to ask how things were going, whether Nerissa had come home, whether they were trying to rebuild their marriage. But that wasn't my business anymore. Their story would continue without me, and mine would continue without them. The ferry back to Dumaguete was less crowded on the return trip. I spent most of the journey reading a book I'd bought at the Calapan port, a mystery novel with a plot I could follow without thinking too hard. When we docked, I felt ready to return to my regular life. But my condo felt different when I walked in. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I was different. The space that had felt empty and haunted 3 days earlier now just felt peaceful. My books were where I'd left them. My coffee maker was ready for tomorrow morning. My bed was made with pillows arranged exactly how I liked them. This was my home, not ours. It had been mine all along. That night, I cooked dinner for myself, something simple and satisfying. I ate slowly, without television or music, just enjoying the taste of food I'd prepared with my own hands. After dinner, I sat on my balcony reading until the mosquitoes drove me inside. I went to bed early and slept through the night without dreaming of anything I could remember. When I woke up the next morning, I made coffee and watched the sunrise over the bay. The view was as beautiful as ever, but now it belonged to me again instead of to the memory of someone who'd never really been there. I was alone, but I wasn't empty. There was a difference, and for the first time in years, I preferred it this way. 6 months later, I'm writing this from a small apartment in London, Ontario, 3 blocks from where my sister Sarah lives. The Philippines feels like a dream I had once, vivid while it lasted but fading now into something I'm not entirely sure really happened. I came back to Canada 2 months after the truth about Nerissa came out. Not running away, just ready to reconnect with the life I'd left behind. My kids were surprised but pleased. My granddaughter Emma barely remembered me at first, but she warmed up quickly when I started showing up at her soccer games and school plays. I got a part-time job at a hardware store, not because I needed the money but because I missed the satisfaction of solving other people's problems. Simple problems with clear solutions. A leaky pipe, a stuck door, a light switch that doesn't work, the kind of problems where you can actually fix things. The work keeps me busy 3 days a week, and the rest of my time is my own. I read books without apologizing for my taste in authors. I eat dinner at whatever time feels right. I go to bed early when I'm tired and stay up late when I'm not. I've rediscovered the simple pleasure of not having to negotiate every decision with another person. People ask if I'm lonely. My sister, my coworkers, neighbors who see me coming and going by myself. But lonely isn't the right word for what I am. I'm alone by choice now, which feels completely different from being alone by default. I dated briefly a woman named Patricia who works at the library and shares my interest in mystery novels. She was kind and intelligent and genuinely interested in getting to know me. But after 3 dinners and several long phone conversations, I realized I wasn't ready to trust my own judgment about women yet. The part of me that had been so wrong about Nerissa needed more time to recalibrate. Patricia understood when I explained that I needed to take a step back. Heartbreak has its own timeline, she said. You can't rush through it just because you think you should be over it by now. She was right. I'd been treating my feelings about Nerissa like a problem to solve rather than an experience to process. Trying to logic my way out of emotions that had their own schedule and rhythm. The hardest part wasn't missing Nerissa herself, but missing the version of myself that had existed when I was with her. The man who felt chosen, valued, necessary. The man who had someone waiting for him at home and someone to share small daily experiences with. That man had been happier than I'd been in years, even if his happiness had been built on lies. But I'm learning that there's a difference between being happy and being at peace. Happiness depends on external circumstances, on other people's choices and actions. Peace comes from accepting what you can and cannot control, from finding contentment in your own company, from knowing who you are when nobody else is watching. I think about Nerissa sometimes, wondering how things worked out with Joel and their son. Whether she found another foreign man to pursue, or whether she decided to build a life within the circumstances she'd been given. I hope she's well, hope her son is healthy, hope she found some version of the security she was looking for. I don't hate her anymore. The anger burned out months ago, leaving behind something closer to sadness for both of us. She was trapped in a situation she couldn't see a way out of, and I was trapped in loneliness I didn't know how to heal. We found each other at exactly the wrong time, when we were both desperate enough to mistake transaction for connection. Emma called me last week to tell me about a drawing she'd made at school. "It's a picture of our family," she said, describing stick figures gathered around a dinner table. "There's Mommy and Daddy and me, and Grandma Sarah, and Grandpa Cliff who lives in Canada." Grandpa Cliff, who lives in Canada. Not Grandpa Cliff who lives far away, or Grandpa Cliff who left us, but Grandpa Cliff who has a place in the world and belongs somewhere specific, who's part of her story, even if he's not part of her daily life. I've been thinking about buying a small house near Sarah, something with a yard where Emma could play when she visits. Nothing fancy, just a place that's mine and looks like the kind of home a grandfather should have, with books on the shelves and tools in the garage and a spare bedroom ready for visitors. I'm 55 now, old enough to know that some chapters of life end before you're ready for them to. Old enough to understand that love isn't just about finding someone who makes you happy, but about becoming someone who can make another person happy without losing yourself in the process. I thought I knew what love was when I was with Nerissa. The breathless excitement, the constant need to be together, the way she seemed to complete parts of me I hadn't known were missing. But that wasn't love. That was dependency. Love doesn't require you to disappear into someone else's life. It doesn't ask you to ignore warning signs or accept secrecy as normal. Real love, I think, is what I'm building with my family now. Steady, reliable, based on truth instead of need. The kind of love that doesn't demand perfection but insists on honesty. The kind that grows stronger over time instead of burning bright and fast. I don't regret going to the Philippines. I needed to leave my old life behind in order to figure out who I really was underneath all the expectations and disappointments. I needed to be completely lost before I could find my way back to myself. But I do regret how desperate I was for someone to fix the emptiness inside me. How willing I was to believe that another person could solve problems that were mine to solve. How I confused being needed with being loved, and how I let loneliness make me blind to obvious truths. The next time I fall in love, if there is a next time, I want to do it from a place of wholeness rather than brokenness. I want to choose someone because they add joy to a life that's already complete, not because they fill a void that makes me incomplete without them. For now, though, I'm content to be alone. To wake up every morning in my own space, drink coffee from my own cup, and face the day without having to perform any particular version of myself for anyone else's benefit. There's a freedom in that I'd forgotten existed. Last weekend, I helped my neighbor install a new kitchen faucet. Simple work, but satisfying. When we finished, he offered me a beer, and we sat on his porch talking about baseball and local politics and whether the winter would be harsh this year. Normal conversation between two men who were comfortable in their own skins. "You seem different since you moved back," he said. "More settled, like you figured something out." I thought about that comment for a long time afterward. What had I figured out? That I didn't need someone else to validate my worth. That being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. That peace was more valuable than excitement, and truth was more important than comfort. That love isn't about finding someone who needs you or someone you need. It's about finding someone you choose, again and again, even when the initial excitement fades and the real work of building a life together begins. I thought I was marrying a Filipina nurse who would take care of me and love me and give my retirement meaning. Instead, I learned that I was the only one who could give my life meaning. That I was the only one responsible for my own happiness. That love without truth isn't love at all, just two people using each other to avoid facing themselves. It was the most expensive lesson I've ever learned, and the most valuable. Because now I know the difference between settling for someone and choosing someone. Between being with someone because you're afraid to be alone, and being with someone because you genuinely want to share your life with them. I sleep well these days. I wake up looking forward to whatever the day might bring. I call my kids regularly and visit my granddaughter and have dinner with my sister on Sundays. I read books that interest me and watch movies that make me laugh and take walks when the weather is nice. It's a quiet life, but it's an honest one. It's mine, completely and without compromise. And after everything I've been through, that feels like enough. Sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly philosophical, I wonder if Nerissa taught me exactly what I needed to learn, even if that wasn't her intention. Maybe I needed to experience that kind of betrayal to understand what real love should feel like. Maybe I needed to lose myself completely before I could find myself again. Or maybe that's just the story I tell myself to make sense of what happened. Either way, I'm grateful to be here now, in this moment, in this life that belongs entirely to me. I don't know what comes next. But for the first time in years, I'm not afraid of the uncertainty. I'm curious about it instead. And that, more than anything else, tells me I'm finally healing. The man I see in the mirror now is older, maybe a little wiser, definitely more careful about who he trusts. But he's also more complete than the man who flew to the Philippines 2 years ago searching for something he couldn't name. He's learned that love isn't about being saved or saving someone else. It's about being seen clearly and choosing to stay anyway. It's about building something together that's stronger than what either person could create alone. Someday, maybe, I'll find that kind of love, but if I don't, I'll be fine. Because I've finally learned the most important lesson of all, how to love myself enough to be alone without being lonely. And that, it turns out, was what I'd been searching for all along.